Hello, everyone. Today's story will break your heart and make you believe in love again. When Diep, a poor girl, risked her life to save James, a powerful CEO, no one expected what came next. Stay with me until the end, because this isn't just a love story. It's a fight for life and the price of silence. That morning, Ly Tu Diep appeared on screen with a gentle smile, attempting to hide the flicker of unease behind her eyes. She greeted the audience warmly, offering her gratitude for their continued support. Her words were calm, composed, but her heart was tightening with silent anxiety. After finishing her short message, she reached for the documents she had carefully prepared, pressed them tightly to her chest, and hurried out the door. Elsewhere, James's father sat in solemn silence, his expression rigid, eyes sharp with determination. "Even if I lose the entire company, I will protect my son," he vowed. His wife, quiet and composed, stood nearby, offering only a firm nod. Meanwhile, Diep was trying desperately to get news about James. Her voice wavered as she questioned an older man she called Uncle, asking about James over and over. "Uncle, please tell me, how is James?" she asked, her voice trembling. But the man's response was cold and dismissive. "This is a family matter. You don't need to worry. Go home." The words struck her like a blade. She paused, but only for a moment. Then, without a word, she began to follow him from a distance. Something was wrong. Deep down, she knew it. Something serious was happening, and she couldn't just walk away. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement as she walked. The breeze stirred her dress, but her steps remained steady. Though she seemed small, even fragile, her resolve was unwavering. With each step she pushed forward, refusing to turn back. No one saw the fear in her chest or the fire in her eyes, but she felt both. And still she walked on, because some truths are too important to ignore. Diep moved through shadowed alleys, careful not to be seen. She followed the older man step by step, her breath held tight, her feet light on the ground. They arrived at an abandoned building. She pressed herself against a wall, heart racing. From inside, voices echoed sharply. "Everything's ready, sir. Once the old man signs the documents, we'll move James and finish the job." Diep's heart clenched. James was being held. They were using his life to trade for an empire. She stepped back, trembling, fumbling for her phone. Her fingers barely held steady as she called Tuan. "I found where James is being kept," she whispered. "His father's here too. But I don't know what to do. Can you call the police? I don't know how to send my location." The call ended. Diep pressed herself against the cold wall, listening, waiting. A low engine hummed in the distance. James's father had arrived. Just as she feared, he was led into a dim room, forced to sit across from the mastermind. "I want all your timber companies under my name," the man demanded. "Sign now, and your son walks free." Diep's lips tightened. Her eyes widened. Every word sliced deeper. This wasn't just about money, this was revenge. Her heart pounded like war drums. In the silence that followed, her resolve solidified. If she stayed still, James might die. But if she moved, everything could fall apart. Her eyes scanned the darkness, searching for a crack, a moment, a chance. The quiet before the storm had arrived. And she, small, trembling, invisible, was the only one standing in its path. Diep crept along the crumbling wall, her breath shallow, every step calculated. Inside, The tense negotiation between James's father and the mastermind continued. Peering through a small crack, she spotted James tied to a chair, exhausted but defiant. Then a rough hand grabbed her shoulder from behind. "Who the hell are you?" a voice growled. She struggled, panic flaring, but before she could scream, a blow struck the back of her head, hard and merciless. Darkness consumed her. She collapsed onto the cold concrete floor. A stabbing pain shot through her lower abdomen, unseen but sharp enough to ripple through unconsciousness. Blood slowly pooled beneath her, thin, red, wrong. No one knew, but that moment wasn't just an injury. It was the fragile shift of a life beginning to break. "Tie her up," the man shouted. But before they could act further, sirens wailed from the distance. Chaos erupted. The kidnappers panicked. James pushed against his restraints as his father stepped forward, shouting, "Don't you touch my son!" The building exploded with footsteps, shouting, confusion. Amidst the madness, Diep lay motionless, the blood still seeping, dust rising around her like a silent storm. One of the rescuers spotted her and cried out, "Someone seriously hurt, get an ambulance." At that moment, James broke free and rushed to her side. He gathered her limp body into his arms. "Diep, no, please stay with me." His voice cracked, his eyes burning red. Around them, the world spiraled into sirens and shouting. But in James's arms, all he could feel was the faint warmth of her skin and the terror that he might lose more than he ever imagined. The air in the small house felt thick, like sorrow clinging to the walls. James sat beside the bed, eyes locked on Diep's pale face. She remained unconscious, her breaths shallow, barely a whisper between life and something darker. The doctor entered, carrying a worn medical bag. She examined Diep carefully, her fingers gentle, her brow furrowed. After a moment, she spoke. She suffered a serious blow to the back of her head. Her blood pressure is dangerously low, but... She paused, choosing her words. "What worries me more are signs of a possible miscarriage." James looked up, stunned. "She was pregnant?" The doctor nodded. "It's early, very early, but with a fall like that, the risk of losing the baby is high. We need to monitor her closely." The words hit James like a wave. He froze, hands trembling as he held Diep's hand. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered. Outside the doorway, James's father stood still, having heard everything. His old eyes stared at his son's crumbling composure, unsure of how to reach across the silence. The space between them wasn't just emotional, it was filled with regret. James bowed his head, voice barely audible. "If I'd warned her, if I'd just protected her." No one replied. Only the soft beeping of the monitor and the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen echoed through the room. In that quiet, James realized the truth. He might lose more than the woman he loved. He might lose the life they had just begun to create. And that truth broke something inside him. Something that couldn't be put back together with words. The morning was quiet, sunlight slipping gently through the old curtain. James sat at the edge of the bed, holding a steaming bowl of porridge. "Diep," he whispered softly, "wake up and eat something." But she remained still, eyes closed, face pale and distant. He set the bowl on the table beside her and reached for her hand, holding it tightly. "It's your favorite," he said quietly. "I made it just for you. Please, just wake up." No answer, no movement. He stood slowly and walked toward the small shed out back, where Hockey curled up in a nest of straw. "Good boy, Hockey," James murmured, kneeling beside the dog. "Watch the house for me, and watch over Diep. I'll be back soon." The wind rustled the garden leaves. Chickens clucked in the distance. The world outside moved gently, peacefully, so unlike the storm inside James's heart. He cleaned the coop, fed the animals, worked in silence. But every time he passed the bedroom door, he paused, listening, hoping. Each time the silence was heavier. Each time his heart sank a little more. That evening, he returned to her side, telling stories as if she could hear. "Hockey ate well today," he said, brushing her hair from her forehead. "The chickens laid their first eggs. Everything's fine out there. We're just waiting for you now." He didn't cry. He couldn't. He simply touched her forehead gently, hoping that maybe, in that unreachable place she was trapped, she could hear him. Or maybe he just needed to believe she could, so he wouldn't fall apart. Inside the quiet room, golden light spilled from the lamp, casting faint shadows across James's face. He sat motionless beside Diep, her hand resting in his, eyes clouded by thoughts too heavy to speak. The door creaked open slowly. His father stepped in, carrying the weight of everything unspoken. For a long moment he said nothing. He just stood there, watching, breathing. Then James spoke, a voice low and bitter. "Why did you let her come? You told her no." His father looked down, his voice barely audible. "I didn't. She followed me. I didn't know until it was too late." Silence returned, heavy and sharp. James clenched his jaw. "You hated her," he whispered, "but she still risked her life, for me, for you, and now she's here, like this." His father stayed quiet, guilt deepening the lines on his face. "Everything that's happened, this company disaster, Diep lying here, it all started with you." The old man closed his eyes. "I know. If I hadn't made enemies with John's family years ago, none of this would have happened." He opened his eyes again, defeated. "I never harmed them, not once, but they believed I did. And now, you're paying for it." James turned away, his voice barely holding steady. "When I came back to this country, things were peaceful. Until you returned." Another pause. His next words hit like a knife. "If something happens to Diep, I'll never forgive you." His father didn't reply. Not out of pride or defiance, but because he knew James was right. And some truths no apology can fix. The night had deepened. In the small room, only the soft hum of the oxygen machine and the dim glow of a bedside lamp remained. James sat silently beside the bed, still holding Diep's hand. Her skin cool, unmoving, like a question waiting for an answer. "Diep," he whispered, barely louder than a breath. "You once told me that as long as we had each other, even a cottage would feel like a palace. I never told you, but I believed you." He lowered his head, pressing his forehead gently against her hand. "I've already started preparing the garden, just behind the house, a spot for vegetables. Hockey knows the path now. You don't have to do anything. Just wake up, that's all." Outside, wind rustled across the tin roof. James stepped out to check on Hockey, lying quietly at the doorstep. The dog didn't bark, just looked up with eyes full of quiet understanding. "She's still not awake," James murmured. Hockey inched closer, nuzzling into his foot. James looked up at the sky. No stars tonight, just black, endless sky. He returned to the room, sat back down, and took Diep's hand once more. "If you can hear me, give me a sign, blink, anything. Just let me know you're still here." Silence. James exhaled, long and tired, He didn't cry. There were no tears left. "I'll wait another day," he said, then another, and another. The night passed. Morning came. Outside, life moved forward. But inside that quiet room, a man sat still, holding the hand of the woman he loved, waiting.
Diệp, một cô gái nghèo nhưng dũng cảm, âm thầm lần theo dấu vết để cứu James, một CEO giàu có, bị bắt cóc. Trong âm thầm trả thù, cô phát hiện sự thật đằng sau lúc bố James bị ép giấy chuyển nhượng toàn bộ công ty để đổi lấy con trai. Trong lúc hoảng loạn, Diệp bị đánh mạnh và ngất liệm. Sau đó, bác sĩ thông báo cô đang mang thai, nguy cơ sảy thai. James suy sụp, ở lại chăm sóc cô từng ngày. Bố anh đối diện với hậu quả từ quá khứ, lặng lẽ hối hận. Khi Diệp vẫn chưa tỉnh lại, hai người đàn ông, một người yêu, một người cha, cùng lặng thinh chờ đến điều kỳ diệu nhỏ bé có thể cứu cả hai cuộc đời.